a lot of times feeling outweighs mathematics in game design. That you'll find this out if you're just starting game design. You'll find this out pretty shortly. That yeah, mathematical perfection is a good place to start, but it almost never ends there for all things. It might end there for some things, but for the really, really important things that you want to have great gravitas and magnitude to their gameplay experience, you might need to swing a little wider than 1, 2, 3 cost. Maybe it's a 1, 3, 5 cost system now, because that 5 just feels so much better to pay 5 and get this giant machine that you're gonna wreak havoc with, or whatever your game is. So yeah, I think working with other people really does help to solidify your chops in terms of explaining games and justifying your decisions. So as a clinical therapist, when I teach students, that's my number one job. Is I have to teach them how to verbally rationalize, or rationalize in writing, your clinical decisions, so that people who are you're working with understand why you're doing what you're doing. And the same thing happens in game design. It's like, okay, this is what I'd like to happen. Here's why. And when you work by yourself, you never have to explain the why. And so you might get caught down um, roads that maybe shouldn't be followed. But when you have somebody else as a check and balance saying, can you explain why? And you can't, maybe you shouldn't go that way. Or, sometimes just a feeling might be good enough to say, oh, it's just the way I feel. I think this would be better this way because. And that goes to the kind of the statement that sometimes feelings outweigh the math of it all, right? That the perception of reality is often the feeling that you get from the game. And we really are making games, in my opinion, as a boxed experience, right? It's a curated, boxed experience that the designers want you to experience something very specific when they put it all in that box. And sometimes math doesn't make the experience better. It just kind of codifies it, makes it into a hierarchy. And then pushing the boundaries on that math now make the feelings much more visceral to the human, who may not think in, numbers as well as a machine does, right?
Yeah, and then another thing I think you're bringing up here is something I've run into with having to write it down and having to explain it to another person in writing before you get to, oh, we're writing the final rule book is so valuable because I can't tell you how many times I've created something that I thought was really cool, but I could not put it into words. I just could not explain it in a way in writing that it made sense to enough people to say, yes, we're gonna do this thing. And knowing
Oh
that
yeah.
early versus knowing that late is so valuable. And so I think there's so much to learn just right there,
Yeah,
even if it's just like writing it. Yeah, go ahead.
if I can't teach it to a person in writing, I don't put it in the game.
Yeah.
I just cut it out. Like if it takes me more words in writing than it takes me in speaking to explain something to a person, plus diagrams and arrows and things, I usually try to cut it out of the game or design it so it's simpler. It's like that's a problem. We need to simplify that because if it's confusing on paper to people who know how to play the game, or to me who wrote the game or made the game, it's going to be so much more confusing to people who are just picking this up for the first time, right? So we have to kind of stop assuming that people know how to play the game. We have to maybe check our own egos and say, oh, it's not because um, they're not smart enough to understand the game. It's because these rules are opaque, or they're very convoluted, or they're only necessary in this very specific edge case. So how would I expect people to remember that? I wouldn't remember that, right? So the idea of empathy as being a huge design skill is really, really important, and one that I think is undervalued. If you are doing anything with design where somebody else is going to someday maybe interact with the thing that you designed, whether it's a door or a game or a light bulb or whatever, you have to have some empathy towards the end user, right? So this is why user experience, UX, is so important, because your user experience may be different than somebody else's user experience, but you should aim to understand how other users interact with your built product, your designed product, because that will, by and large, affect how they feel about it and their ratings of it and their evangelizing of it, or they're talking about it or selling it to other people, right? And you've seen examples of this just in board games, where you're like, I don't know why this game is so popular, and then people talk about it or explain it to you, or you, God forbid, go play it, and now you get it because it's the experience that matters, not the mathematics of it that matter, right? Or not the nuts and bolts of it. And it's the holistic experience of it that make it so great. So, yeah, there's definitely a lot to it about making things as approachable as possible, having empathy to the players, for the players, that it's not just this designer as this, omnipotent figure handing down rules. Those rules have to be interpreted and understood. And when they're not interpreted and understood in the way that they're intended to be, things go poorly. And um, my area of expertise is actually communication science, right? So, communication isn't just me talking to you, right? Communication is when you, Gabe, have the same idea in your head that I intended you to have, that's in my head. That's communication. We both agree that Gabe's shirt is very blue, right? Do you agree?
I agree.
Right. Then now we communicated, right?
Right.
But when a designer is just writing rules, we're assuming communication's happening. But is it really? It isn't if the reader doesn't have the same idea that you had in your head at the time. For something like technical writing and rules writing, that's very important. For something like a novel, not as important, right? Because people can interpret words differently, and that's allowed. That's fine. But if you expect your game to be played the way it's supposed to be played, you need to make some real attempts at understanding how people on the other side of the rules will interpret those and understand those rules. Right. So it's very important to test your rules. That it's actually more important to test your rules than it is to test your game.
Yeah, absolutely.
But
Because
but
this is a
also test your game.
situation, right? This is a situation where if you get something wrong in the rules, potentially the entire experience is broken and it's not
Oh
going to
yeah,
work.
the experience is very broken. And
Yeah,
that's the thing about these designer games, these boutique games, these games that have people's names on them, et cetera, et cetera. They are intended with a purpose, typically, right? There is some authorial intent, usually. I know there's definitely pushback against that, and mass market games aren't necessarily like that. And that's where most people have their first game experiences. But they're simpler, right? But for sure, I have an intention when I make a game, and I have an intended experience that I'd like you to have when you play that game. And if you don't, that's not your fault. That's actually my fault, because I probably didn't communicate how to have that experience as strongly as I should have, or as cleanly, as clearly as I should have or could have. And then maybe also I didn't design it well enough for you to have that experience, because the design isn't just the game itself, it's the whole package, right? It's a product now, and we have to start thinking about product design as opposed to just game design.